"You'll need to move along, sir. This pass expired in March," Captain Whitney Vandergrift said, not to the old man, but to the Marine beside her, as if the old man were furniture too heavy to address directly. The old man will not say why he comes to the gate every year with the same bent tool, only that he is owed 5 minutes on the ridge before the snow changes, and he did not say it now either. He set his canvas roll down on the gravel, easy, both hands, the way another man might set down a bag of groceries he intended to pick back up in a minute. Lance Corporal Preston Ogle looked at the pass in his hand, then at the man in the creekstone coat, then back at the pass, as though the paper might explain something the man's face did not. A dozen Marines had already begun to gather near the flagpole, drawn by nothing more than the particular gravity of a raised voice at a gate on an otherwise quiet Tuesday. Vandergrift held her laminated visitor policy card in one hand, like a hymnal she'd memorized long ago, and no longer needed to open, and she did not open it now. "Per the directive," she said, "unescorted visitors require current authorization renewed annually. This one lapsed 8 months ago. I don't make the rule, I enforce it." "He says he's been coming for years, ma'am," Ogle said. "Says it's the same day every year. That's not policy, Lance Corporal. That's sentiment." A ripple of laughter moved through the gathering Marines, quick and unkind in the way laughter is when it costs the laugher nothing. Vandergrift did not smile, but she let the laughter breathe a moment before continuing, the way a woman confident of her audience lets a pause do her work for her. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one time to step back from the gate." The old man did not step back. He did not step forward either. He stood with his weight settled onto his right leg, the left knee locked stiff beneath a pair of canvas trousers gone soft at the seams, and he looked past Vandergrift entirely, out toward the ridge behind the base, the way a man checks a sky before deciding whether to bring in the wash. If you have ever watched someone dismiss a person they hadn't bothered to ask about, sit with this one a while. "Sir," Vandergrift's voice sharpened by exactly one register, the register reserved for people who have decided a conversation is over before the other party has agreed to it. "I need your name, and I need it now, or Lance Corporal Ogle is going to walk you back to your vehicle." "Emmett Overby," the old man said plainly, as if reading it off a form he'd filled out 10,000 times. He did not raise his voice to match hers. He never once raised his voice at all. He reached down, slow, favoring the bad knee, and rested one hand flat on top of the canvas roll at his feet, not gripping it, not protecting it, just resting there, the way a man rests a hand on a gate he built with his own 2 hands and has no need to prove he built. Somewhere behind the gathering crowd, a radio crackled with a call for the sergeant major, and nobody there yet understood what that call would cost the woman standing at the gate, or what it would give back to the man she had just ordered off the base he had helped raise out of the mountain rock 55 years before she was born. The coat told most of it, if anyone had thought to read it. Canvas, once the brown of a barn door, faded now to the gray-green of creekstone after a hard rain, its collar buttoned crooked on the left side in a way that looked, to Vandergrift's practiced eye, like carelessness. It was not carelessness. The knee that would not bend past a certain angle would not let him reach that button properly anymore, and he had made his peace with a crooked collar the same season he'd made his peace with a great many other things a younger man fusses over and an old one lets go. Emmett Overby was 78 years old, and he wore his age the way he wore the coat, functional, unadorned, buttoned wrong on purpose, rather than not at all. He carried always a small ledger in his breast pocket, its cover softened to felt by decades of handling, its pages ruled by hand because he had never trusted a printed ledger to hold a name the way a man's own writing could. He did not open it at the gate. He never opened it in front of strangers. But his hand found it once, briefly, through the canvas, the way another man checks for his keys, and then returned to the roll at his feet. Inside that roll, wrapped in a strip of oiled cloth going back further than most of the Marines watching him had been alive, lay an aluminum anchor no longer than a forearm, its shaft bent once, precisely, at an angle no accident could account for, and no manufacturer would have shipped. A stamp near its head read a string of letters worn nearly smooth by handling, legible only to a man who already knew what he was looking for. He had carried that anchor onto this base on this same week every year, for longer than Captain Vandergrift had been in uniform, and he had never once explained why, not to the gate guards who'd changed a dozen times over, not to the officers who'd come and gone with their clipped haircuts and their laminated cards, not even, in later years, to himself in so many words. He checked his watch now, an old habit that had outlived its usefulness since he no longer needed to time anything, and he glanced past it to a small notebook page folded into the ledger's back cover, a photocopy of a gate log from 11 years past, its ink faded to the brown of weak tea, one line circled in pencil. Nadine Overby. The line read, "Visitor, escort not required," and beneath it a date he did not need to check against today's, because he had already checked it 3 times since sunrise. He said her name to the gate log the way another man might sign a form, because for 11 years that was the only line on the page that still felt like home. She had come with him every year until her lungs gave out on her, slow, over 18 months, in a hospital bed 40 miles from this gate, and every year since he had come alone and signed his own name in the space beside where hers used to go, as though the log itself remembered the shape of 2 names better than one. He had married her in 1965, 2 years after he'd first put on the uniform, and for 49 years she had kept a ledger of her own, a household one, mundane, groceries and doctor visits, and the names of neighbors' children, because she said somebody in the house needed to keep track of things that weren't life and death, since he'd taken all the life and death ones for himself. It was a joke between them for decades, low and dry and never explained to outsiders, and it was not a joke anymore. Only a small, warm ache he carried the way he carried the anchor, without display, without complaint, checked once a year against the only date that mattered. Captain Vandergrift, 20 feet away, had already turned from him, distracted by something sharper and more immediate than an old man's expired pass. A civilian contractor's badge reader at the secondary vehicle gate had failed to log an entry 3 times in the last hour, and she'd caught it not from a report, but from the rhythm of the gate arm itself, rising and falling a half-second faster than the badge scanner's confirmation tone, a gap of maybe 0.4 of a second, nothing a checklist would flag, everything a trained eye would. She crossed the yard at a clip, cutting off a corporal mid-sentence, and pulled the access log herself rather than waiting on IT, because she had learned 2 years into this job that waiting on IT was how small gaps became large ones. "This reader's been passing on badge proximity alone since 1000, she said to the gate sergeant, tapping the screen without needing to raise her voice to be obeyed. "No pin confirmation logged on 3 of the last 9 badges. Pull it offline and route to the primary gate until maintenance clears it." The sergeant scrambled. She did not gloat. She simply moved to the next thing, already dictating a line for the incident report in her head, already thinking 2 steps past the problem to the fix, which was, whatever else could be said of her, the mark of someone who was good at this particular job in a way that had nothing to do with laminated cards. It was this same sharpness, turned back toward the gate a few minutes later, that convinced her the old man's stillness was a kind of insolence rather than what it actually was. "Sir, I caught a legitimate security lapse in the time it's taken you to decide whether you're going to cooperate," she said, and a few of the gathered Marines snickered at that, because it landed the way she meant it to land. Clever, a little cutting, delivered with the ease of someone used to being the smartest person at a gate. "That pass expired in March. I don't know what this is to you, but to me it's a compliance issue, and I've got half a mind to call base police and let them sort out your paperwork for you." "Go on and call them, ma'am, if that's what the moment calls for," Emmett said. He did not sound afraid of the phrase. He sounded like a man agreeing to wait for a bus he already knew the schedule of. Vandergrift's jaw tightened at that, at the sheer unbothered calm of it, because she had expected either an apology or an argument and gotten neither, and a laugh went up from 2 Marines near the flagpole, quick and low, the kind of laugh that says we all see how this ends. Lance Corporal Ogle did not laugh. He stood with the expired pass still in his hand, looking at the old man's boots, noticing for no reason he could name that they were laced in a pattern he'd only ever seen on his grandfather, a double loop meant to hold in deep snow, useless on gravel, kept anyway. "Ma'am," Ogle said, careful. "He did say something a minute ago. About the wind." "About the wind," Vandergrift repeated, flat, the way one repeats a phrase to prove how little it deserves repeating. Emmett had, in fact, said something about the wind, unprompted. Somewhere between the second dismissal and the threat of base police, nodding once toward the ridge behind the training yard. "That wind's backed around to the northwest since noon," he'd said, mild as weather itself. "You'll want to look at your drainage courses on the east face before dark. Snow will load different on that slope than it does on the west, and it doesn't load even." Nobody had asked him. He had simply said it, the way a man mentions a leak in a roof he no longer owns but still can't walk past without noticing. Ogle had written it down anyway, in the little notebook he kept for gate incidents. Not because he understood it, but because something in the flat certainty of it made his pen move before his judgment weighed in. He did not know, standing there, that 3 ridgelines away a training squad's emergency beacon had drifted somewhere the base's mapping software had never modeled correctly, or that the man in front of him could likely have walked to within 30 yards of it blind. He only knew that the sentence had the shape of something true, the specific gravity of a fact rather than a guess, and that shape unsettled him more than the old man's silence had. "I need identification," Vandergrift said, done now with weather and with waiting. "A name isn't enough. Military ID, veteran's card, something with a number on it, or this conversation is finished and you're escorted to your vehicle." Emmett reached toward his coat, slow, and did not produce a card. He looked at her and past her, at the gathering crowd that had grown to perhaps 30 now, drawn the way crowds are always drawn to the smell of someone about to be humiliated in public. He straightened, as much as the knee allowed, bracing his weight forward the way a man braces on a slope only he can feel underfoot. "Call sign Anvil 7, he said. "That's what they'll want to hear, if anybody left who remembers asking for it." The words did not carry far. He had not raised his voice to say them. But somewhere behind the crowd, halfway across the yard, a sergeant major already walking toward the disturbance with a phone against his ear stopped mid-stride, one boot still raised an inch off the gravel, and did not finish the sentence he had been speaking into the phone. Sergeant Major Reed Gant had been 3 words into telling his operations chief he'd handle the gate situation personally and get back to him inside the hour, and the 4th word never came. His hand dropped from his ear. The phone hung there a moment against his thigh before he seemed to remember he was holding it, and by then he had already crossed half the distance to the gate at a pace that made 2 junior Marines step out of his path without being told to. The 8 Marines nearest the flagpole, the ones who had laughed loudest a minute before, went quiet first, and not all for the same reason. 2 of them had come up through mountain survival school under instructors who still told, half as legend and half as history, the story of a program that used to run beacons no satellite could jam and no whiteout could blind, founded by a name nobody currently on base could actually put a face to. A third, a corporal named Dylan Quillen, had grown up 40 miles from here and had heard his own grandfather mention an Anvil call sign once at a funeral, in the tone men use for things they were told not to repeat. The rest simply read the sergeant major's face, which had gone the particular gray of a man doing arithmetic he thought he'd never need to do again, and understood, before any of them understood why, that the joke currently happening at this gate had stopped being a joke about 4 seconds ago. Gant stopped an arm's length from Vandergrift without acknowledging her at all, his eyes fixed on the old man in the canvas coat, on the crooked collar, on the hand resting flat on the canvas roll. "Say that again," Gant said. His own voice had gone low, careful, the voice of a man testing whether a floor will hold his weight before he steps fully onto it. "Anvil 7, Emmett said again, unbothered, as though repeating an address to someone who'd missed it the first time. Gant's right hand, the one he'd been holding the phone with, opened and closed once at his side, and did not close all the way. 3 fingers came together. The last 2 lagged half a second behind, stiff in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked down at that hand for a moment as if it belonged to someone else, then back up at Emmett, and something in his face that had been composed a moment ago was no longer composed at all. "Ma'am," Gant said, without turning to look at Vandergrift, "stand down the escort." "Sergeant Major, this man's authorization lapsed?" "Stand it down." He said it quietly. He did not need to say it twice. Something in the flatness of it did more work than volume could have, and Vandergrift, for the first time since she'd walked up to that gate, closed her mouth on a sentence she'd already half formed. The 8 Marines by the flagpole had gone entirely still now, the kind of stillness that isn't posture but attention, the collective holding of breath that happens when people sense a story is turning into something they will be asked about later and want to remember correctly. Ogle's pen had stopped moving in his notebook. Somewhere at the edge of the crowd, Corporal Quillen mouthed the word to himself, anvil, testing it, watching the sergeant major's ruined right hand as if it were an answer to a question he hadn't known to ask. Gant took one more step toward Emmett, closing the last of the distance, and for a long moment neither man said anything at all. It was Gant who broke first, not with an apology and not yet with an explanation, but with a single question, rough at the edges. "You still carry the anchor?" Emmett's hand tightened just slightly on the canvas roll at his feet. "Every year," he said. "Same week." Gant nodded once, slow, like a man confirming a fact he had prayed against for 27 years and was relieved finally to have confirmed. He did not explain himself yet. He turned instead to Vandergrift, and when he spoke again, his voice had recovered its rank, but none of its ease. "Captain, walk with me. There's something about a program retirement ceremony you and I need to discuss before Friday, and I think this man is going to need to be standing next to us when we do it." The word ceremony landed on Vandergrift oddly, the way an unfamiliar key turns in a lock that shouldn't accept it, and for the first time all morning, her laminated card stayed in her jacket pocket, unconsulted, useless against whatever was unfolding in front of her. They walked, the 3 of them, past the gathering Marines and into the shade of the operations building. And it was there, over the next quarter hour, that Sergeant Major Gant told it, the way men tell things they have carried a long time and are grateful, finally, to set down. 5 days from now, he said, the base intended to hold a formal retirement ceremony for the high-altitude mountain rescue beacon program, folding its history and its equipment into an archive display, complete with a bronze plaque already cast at the machine shop in the next county, and a guest list already mailed to the families of men the program had once found alive in conditions that should have killed them. The plaque credited the program's founding to a training command officer named on every surviving requisition form from 19 years back, a name that had drifted, uncontested, into base legend simply because no one currently serving had ever thought to ask an old man at the gate whether the record matched the mountain. Vandergrift listened with her arms folded, and somewhere in the telling her folded arms loosened, because a second fact had begun surfacing behind her eyes that had nothing to do with Emmett Overby and everything to do with her own name on a commendation 2 years old. She had been praised, formally in writing, for streamlining legacy protocols and consolidating redundant training line budgets, a commendation built directly on top of the very decision, made 19 years before she'd ever pinned on her bars, that had folded this program's funding elsewhere and left its founder's name to rot quietly off the record. "That budget line," she said slowly, more to herself than to Gant, "the one I cited in my own review, that's the same consolidation." "It's the same consolidation," Gant said. She did not argue it. And that, more than anything said at the gate, told the rest of them how far the ground beneath her had already shifted. A woman who quoted policy the way Scripture gets quoted did not need it explained to her twice that her own signed recommendation now sat on top of a hole she hadn't known was there. She turned, once, to look back through the window toward the yard where the old man still stood, canvas roll at his feet, waiting the way he had waited at the gate, unbothered by any of it. And for the first time that morning, she looked at him the way you look at a structure you've just realized is load-bearing. Vandergrift did not sleep on it. She pulled the archive requisition files herself that same afternoon, cross-referencing every surviving form against the base's digitized budget history, and her spreadsheet, when it finished running, told her exactly what she expected it to tell her. The training command officer's name appeared, clean and unbroken, on every single requisition tied to the Beacon program's founding. Going back 19 years, she ran it 3 times. The result did not change. By the 3rd pass, her jaw had set in the particular way of someone whose tools have just told her something is true, and someone else is telling her it is false, and she did not yet know which of them to believe. "Your own numbers are right," Emmett said. when Gant brought him in to look at the printed pages spread across the table. "That's not where the lie is." "Then where is it?" Vandergrift said, and for once there was no policy card behind the question, only a woman genuinely asking. "Your forms tell you who signed for the money. They can't tell you who came in after and changed whose name got typed onto the founding line." Emmett set one weathered finger on the earliest requisition sheet, dated the year the program folded. "I signed for that beacon equipment myself, in this same building, same week, 23 years into wearing this uniform. There's a carbon copy of that page somewhere, if anyone kept carbons back then, and it won't match what's typed on your archive copy now." Gant exhaled, slow, and set his ruined hand flat on the table beside the forms. The 3 good fingers spread, the last 2 curled slightly inward the way they'd been curled for 27 years. "I can tell you who had signing authority to make that kind of change and reason enough to want it clean," he said. Then, Major Devereaux ran the budget consolidation that folded this program's line into the contractor deal for the current Beacon fleet. He's a colonel now. He's the base commander who'll be standing at that podium Friday shaking hands over a plaque with the wrong name on it, unless somebody tells him otherwise first. Vandergrift's hands for the first time all day went still on the table rather than reaching for anything. She did not say the word cover-up, and neither did Gant, because neither of them needed to. The shape of it sat plainly enough between the requisition dates and the consolidation memo and the name that had quietly replaced another man's on a form nobody had thought worth double-checking for 19 years. "Why?" Vandergrift said finally to Emmett. "Didn't you ever correct it? 19 years is a long time to let your own name go missing." Emmett looked at his hands a moment before answering, the way he looked at most things before answering them. "Wasn't about my name," he said. "I've got a ledger with better names in it than mine. I came back every year for the ridge, not the plaque." Gant's jaw worked once, and he looked down at his own hand again, flexing it slowly, the way he had 100 times over 27 years without ever once explaining to anyone why he did it. 1991, he said, quiet, mostly to Vandergrift, though his eyes stayed on Emmett. "I was a corporal, second week attached to a mountain unit I had no business being assigned to. Went down a ravine chasing a training marker I shouldn't have been chasing alone, broke this hand in 3 places against the rock on the way down, and by the time anybody found me, the cold had already started working on it. Overby found me, splinted this hand himself out there, with strapping and a tent stake and about 4 inches of parachute cord, kept the blood moving until they could fly me out. Surgeon told me later another hour without that splint, and I'd have lost use of it for good." He held the hand up, the 2 curled fingers plain in the light. "I've still got most of it. Every year on this week I think about calling him and never do, because I never knew what a man says to somebody who did that for him and asked for nothing after." The room held that a moment, nobody moving to fill it, and Emmett Overby, who had said very little all day, said even less now, only reached over, briefly, and set 2 fingers against the back of Gant's ruined hand, the way a man checks a repair he made decades ago and finds it, against all odds, still holding. The ceremony's guest list, when Vandergrift finally pulled it in full that evening, carried 2 names that stopped her cold in a way the spreadsheet numbers never had. A woman named Harriet Pickens, traveling in from 3 states over to represent her late father, and a man named Foster Renfro, coming with his own grown daughter, both descendants of Marines the program's records listed only by rank and unit, found alive in conditions the archive summarized in a single dry sentence each. Vandergrift brought the names to Emmett herself, not as an accusation and not as a request, but the way one brings a question to someone who might actually be able to answer it. Emmett did not hand over his ledger. Gant asked once, gently, and Vandergrift did not ask at all, having learned enough that day to know some things are not requested twice. "There's names in here belonging to families who never knew how their men were found," Emmett said, his hand resting flat over the felt soft cover the way it had rested on the canvas roll that morning. "That's not paperwork. That's not going in anybody's archive display." But he opened it briefly, alone at the table, and found the 2 pages he was looking for. And when Harriet Pickens and Foster Renfro arrived 2 days later for a walkthrough ahead of the ceremony, he read the entries aloud to them himself, standing, his weight braced forward on the good knee. Pickens, Staff Sergeant, he read. Located 0440, ridge drainage east face, beacon signal weak but holding, temperature 11 below. Compass recovered with him, stamped issue mark same as the beacon anchor. He looked up at Harriet, whose hand had gone to her mouth without her seeming to notice it had moved there. That stamp on his compass is the same one on the tool I carry every year. Same forge, same week it was made. I filed the serial numbers myself, so a man lost on that mountain would always be carrying a piece of the same metal that was looking for him. Foster Renfro's daughter reached for her father's hand, while Emmett read the second entry, and somewhere in the reading Vandergrift, standing at the back of the room with a folder of corrected paperwork under her arm, understood for the first time what her spreadsheet had never been built to measure, not who had signed a form, but who had never stopped signing his name, quietly, in a ledger nobody official had ever asked to see. She did not wait for authorization to act on what she now knew. Over the following 2 days, Captain Vandergrift walked corrected documentation through 3 separate offices herself: personnel records, base history archive, and the machine shop handling the plaque recast, standing in each one until the correction was logged rather than filed for later. It cost the unit's last discretionary fiscal margin to recast the bronze on that timeline, and she signed off on the expense herself, in writing, alongside a formal amendment to her own 2-year-old commendation, striking the language that had praised the very consolidation she now understood to have buried a man's name. "You don't have to fix your own file over this," Emmett told her, the one time she mentioned it aloud, almost embarrassed by how plainly she needed to say it out loud to someone. "I put my name on something built on a lie I didn't know was there," Vandergrift said. "Per the directive, that gets corrected. I'm not asking permission for this one." It was the first time all week she'd used the phrase and meant something entirely different by it. When Colonel Devereaux was finally informed, in a closed-door meeting, Vandergrift insisted on attending. He did not deny the 19-year-old paperwork, only grew very quiet and asked once whether Overby intended to make it public. Emmett's answer, relayed secondhand and never repeated with any relish by anyone who heard it, asked for nothing of the colonel at all beyond the plaque bearing its true history. He wanted no apology entered into any record, no ceremony of his own, no line in the program crediting his name above any other man who'd worn the uniform in that unit. "Put the program's original designation on it," he said, when Gant asked what he wanted written. "Anvil Station. That's what we called it before anybody thought it needed a founder's name attached at all." The ceremony went forward 5 days later, exactly on schedule, the plaque recast and correct, the program's history restored to its own name rather than a stolen one, and the Mountain Rescue Beacon program formally retired from active use with a dignity it had nearly lost twice over Chi, once to a budget line 19 years ago, and once, almost, to an expired pass at a gate. Colonel Devereaux spoke briefly and without embellishment, and Harriet Pickens and Foster Renfro sat in the front row beside a case built specially for the occasion, glass on 4 sides, lit from above. Inside that case, resting on a strip of the same oiled cloth it had traveled in for decades, lay the bent aluminum anchor, its shaft angled at 9 degrees, exactly as it had come off the mountain the day it was forged, and never once straightened since. Sergeant Major Reed Gant stood near the case through the whole ceremony, his ruined hand resting lightly against the glass, and did not move it the entire time. Emmett Overby did not sit in the front row. He stood at the back near the door in the same canvas coat, collar buttoned crooked as ever, and when the ceremony ended and the crowd began to thin, he slipped out ahead of most of it, the way he always had, the way he intended to keep doing for as many Aprils as his knee would allow him the ridge. He drove up alone the next morning, parking where he always parked, and walked as far as the knee would carry him toward the drainage on the east face. The wind backed around exactly where he'd said it would be. He did not carry the anchor with him this time. It had a case now, and a light, and 2 families who would visit it when they needed to remember that somebody had gone looking for their fathers in the dark, and found them. At the gate on his way out, Lance Corporal Ogle was on duty again, and this time he did not check a laminated card at all. He simply opened the log, found the space beneath a faded line that read, "Nadine Overby, visitor, escort not required," and wrote beneath it, "Emmett Overby," and left the reason for the visit blank, because some things a gate log was never built to hold. Some names get printed, the ones that matter get carried. The bent aluminum anchor sat behind its glass long after the crowd had gone home, and the folding chairs had been stacked away, its 9-degree bend catching the morning light exactly as it had caught it the day it was forged, and it would go on catching that same light quietly, whether or not anyone stopped to look.